Your body woke up before the alarm, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes, but it woke up on its own, and then the alarm went off anyway, and you hit snooze, and now you feel worse than if you just stayed asleep. That's strange if you think about it. You have a perfectly functioning internal clock. It knew, to the minute, when morning was coming, and yet every weekday morning you override it with a device invented by an industry that needed trains to run on schedule. Those two things are connected, more directly than you'd expect. There's something inside you older than language, older than agriculture, older than the wheel. Every cell in your body, not just your brain, but your liver, your skin, your spleen, runs on a biological clock synchronized to the rotation of the earth. Scientists call it the circadian rhythm, but that term makes it sound like a minor detail, a footnote in biology. It isn't. It's one of the most ancient mechanisms in living things. Researchers trace its origins back roughly 3.5 billion years, before complex life, before oxygen, before anything we'd recognize as an organism. Your body has been keeping time longer than the sun has had planets orbiting it, which makes the next part interesting, because about 140 years ago, someone decided that clock was inconvenient. Go back to the 1870s, not to look at the politics or the economics, just to look at what time felt like. In most of North America, time was local, genuinely local. Each town set its clocks to solar noon, the exact moment the sun reached its peak above that specific piece of ground, which meant that if you traveled west by 200 miles, local time was behind by about 12 minutes. Not arbitrarily, actually behind, because the sun reached those rooftops later. This wasn't disorder, it was precision, each community living in honest alignment with its own sky. People also slept differently then, not just earlier, differently. There's a body of historical and anthropological research suggesting that the standard sleep pattern for most of pre-industrial humanity wasn't 8 consecutive hours. It was 2 separate segments. A first sleep, waking somewhere in the middle of the night, and a second sleep. The hours in between weren't lost time. People used them to pray, to think, to have sex, to take medicine, to talk. The night had a middle, and the middle had a purpose. That's not a medieval quirk. That's what sleep looks like when nothing is forcing it into a standardized shape. But something was coming that would change the shape of almost everything. The railroads. By the 1880s, American railroads were operating across a continent using over 60 different local time standards. 68, depending on how you count. A train leaving one city and arriving in another had to navigate schedules calibrated to dozens of different solar noons. Selling a connecting ticket was becoming nearly impossible. The paperwork was a disaster. So the railroad industry held a convention. A man named William F. Allen, secretary of the American Railroad Association, stood up and proposed something elegant. Divide the continent into 4 zones. Set everyone within each zone to the same time. Done. On November 18, 1883, at noon on the 75th meridian, standard railway time went into effect across North America. No act of Congress, no public referendum, no vote of any kind. A private industry association announced a new time system, the newspapers printed the new schedules, and the nation adjusted its clocks. It took about a week. Sit with that for a moment. In roughly 7 days, an arrangement between human bodies and the natural world that had functioned continuously for thousands of years, for all of recorded history and before, was quietly discontinued. Not because it was failing, because it was inconvenient for train schedules. What happened next moved faster than most people realize. Within a decade, factories had a new technology, the time clock, a machine that stamped the exact minute you arrived and the exact minute you left. Before 1890, this object did not exist. Work happened. It started. It ended. It was measured by what got done. Now it was measured by the minute, and the minute was owned by the employer. There are first-hand accounts from that era of factory owners who tampered with the clocks on their floors, slowing them down in the morning to squeeze extra minutes before the official start of a shift, speeding them up in the afternoon. Some hid the clocks entirely. The workers had no independent way to verify the time. Solar noon was no longer the reference point. The only clock that mattered was the one on the factory wall, and that clock belonged to management. This is where it gets strange to think about. The same standardization that solved the railroad scheduling problem also, almost immediately, created a new kind of labor vulnerability. When time became abstract, when it was no longer verifiable by looking at the sky, it became something that could be controlled by whoever owned the instruments for measuring it. But maybe that's coincidence. Patterns can be projected onto history just as easily as they can be extracted from it. Let's stay with what's documented. In 1918, the time zones the railroads had invented in 1883 became federal law. The Interstate Commerce Commission, originally created to regulate railroads, was given authority over time coordination, and in the same legislation, the United States introduced daylight saving time, framed as a wartime energy conservation measure. It was repealed after the war, reinstated during the next war, made permanent in some states, optional in others, repealed again federally, reinstated again. The current system is still in dispute. Dozens of states have passed or proposed legislation to end the twice-yearly clock change. The debates happen every few years and resolve nothing. Here's the detail most of those debates skip over. The legal standard for determining time zone boundaries in the United States, written into federal law and still in effect, is the convenience of commerce, not biology, not health, not community preference. Commerce, now the science. Circadian disruption, which is what happens when your biological clock is forced to operate out of sync with its environment, is not a minor inconvenience. It's associated with elevated risks of metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, psychological conditions, and workplace accidents. Researchers studying shift workers have documented these effects for decades. But here's the part that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. When researchers studied sleep patterns in small pre-industrial communities, groups that had no electric light, no alarm clocks, no fixed work schedules, they found something specific. Sleep naturally shifted to occur toward the end of the night, during the period of lowest ambient temperature. People fell asleep as temperatures dropped and woke as temperatures rose. That's exactly how circadian rhythms are supposed to work. Temperature is one of the primary environmental cues that synchronizes the body's internal clock. Modern insomnia rates are high, chronically high. The clinical assumption for most of the 20th century was that insomnia was an individual problem. Psychology, anxiety, poor sleep hygiene. But researchers who know this pre-industrial sleep data have started asking a different question. What if it's not individual? What if the mismatch is structural? A biological clock still calibrated to something ancient, running inside a body required to operate on a schedule invented in 1883 so that trains could connect in Chicago. Here's where this gets harder to dismiss. The same pattern shows up elsewhere. Musical pitch wasn't always standardized. For most of Western history, the note A varied from region to region, ensemble to ensemble. In the 20th century, an international standard was adopted, 440 Hz. Some musicians resisted. The argument for standardization was practicality. Orchestras could now collaborate across borders. The argument against was subtler. Something local, organic, particular was being dissolved into something universal and imposed. Money, identity documents, standard measurements. In each case, the history follows a similar arc. A diverse local ecology of practices gets replaced by a single, centralized standard. The justification is efficiency. The implementation comes from industry, or from the state, or from both working in sequence. And eventually the thing it replaced becomes so invisible that it requires archaeology to find. This doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. It means there's a logic. The logic of scale, which tends to compress particularity into uniformity, regardless of anyone's intentions. Time followed that logic before almost anything else did. In 1884, 1 year after the railroad standardized North American time, representatives from 25 nations met in Washington for the International Meridian Conference. They divided the Earth into 24 equal segments. Greenwich was chosen as the reference point. Every human being on the planet was assigned to a zone. The historian who documented the social consequences of the telegraph, the technology that made synchronized time operationally possible, described standard time as perhaps the most significant social consequence of that invention. Significant is the right word, but the sentence usually stops there. When something is described as significant, the next question should be, significant for what, and at whose cost? The railroads needed the zones to run their schedules. The factories needed the punch clock to manage their labor. The government needed the law to administer both. Each of those institutions got what it needed from the 1883 decision and what followed. The body didn't get a seat at that convention. During the early 2020s, when remote work became widespread and commute schedules temporarily disappeared for a large portion of the workforce, researchers noticed something. People's sleep patterns shifted. Not randomly, they shifted in a consistent direction. Later to bed, later to rise, with the total amount of sleep increasing for most people by 40 minutes to an hour. Closer, the researchers noted, to what natural solar time would suggest for their locations. The moment external scheduling pressure lifted even slightly, the body began drifting back toward something. Toward what, exactly, is an interesting question. Chronotypes. The spectrum between extreme morning people and extreme night people are now a serious area of sleep research. The conventional framing treats them as personality variations, natural diversity in the population. Some people are larks, some are owls, most are somewhere in between. But in the light of everything else, what if chronotype isn't personality? What if it's the distance between where your body's clock is set and where the 75th meridian says noon should be? Your body woke up before the alarm this morning. It's been doing that, in one form or another, for longer than your family has existed, longer than your language has existed, longer than the civilization that built the alarm has existed. On November 18, 1883, a group of railroad executives decided that this clock, the one running in your cells, calibrated by billions of years of sunrise and temperature drop and circadian signal, was getting in the way of something more important. And the strange part isn't that they made that decision. The strange part is that no one, at any scale, has ever really asked what was lost when they did, or whether we could get any of it back, or whether the body, still waking up before the alarm every Monday morning, is trying to tell us something, and we're just hitting snooze.